Evening, everybody. Do I need to introduce myself? No. Right. I'm not going to. Well, thank you for coming to the second thrilling instalment of this series. We're continuing in celebration of the 500th anniversary of the Tyndale Bible, which was the first complete translation of the New Testament by William Tyndale in 1526, which allowed the Gospels, Acts, Hebrews, Revelation, and the letters of Paul, Peter, James, John, and Jude to be read in English for the very first time. And what we've set out to do in this series is to explore how the New Testament came to be in the first instance, and then how it came to be translated into English by Tyndale and all of those who came after him. And last week, we looked at the initial composition of the books of the New Testament, who wrote them, when, and why. And we looked at a range of evidence. We did a bit of papyrology, looking at the earliest surviving fragments of the Gospels. We looked at the content of the books themselves, as well as the works of early theologians and historians like Clement of Rome, Tertullian, and Eusebius, just to see what clues we could gather to help us answer those questions. And the conclusions that we drew were that all the books of the New Testament were completed and in circulation by the end of the 1st century BC. And we noted that this gives us a maximum period of about 60 years between the death and resurrection of Jesus and the composition of the New Testament. In other words, close enough to Jesus' lifetime for the people involved in writing the books and the letters to have known Jesus themselves, or at least to have known people who knew Jesus. And we further noted that when it comes to the Gospels, these are based heavily, if not exclusively, on first-hand eyewitness accounts of the events of Jesus' ministry. And we concluded that that should give us a huge amount of confidence that what we read in the New Testament is both authoritative and credible. And this week, we're going to look at how the 27 books that make up the New Testament came to make up the New Testament. In other words, how the Canon came together. And our starting point for this is going to be slightly left field, and it's the works of this man, Dan Brown, who's the author of the hugely successful multi-million selling books, The Da Vinci Code and Angels and Demons. And if you've ever read either of those or heard Brown speak about them, then you probably understand why we're choosing to start here. Because Dan Brown believes that the New Testament that we read today is based on a conspiracy. And it's a conspiracy to suppress the truth about Jesus through promoting only those books which align with the preferred orthodoxy of the church. And Brown states that, in fact, there are a number of secret writings that tell a very different story about Jesus, but the church has organized a cover-up for centuries to prevent this story from emerging. And that's because it's a story which, according to Brown, gives the lie to Jesus' divinity and reveals instead that he married Mary Magdalene, had kids, and lived to a ripe old age. And Brown claims that more than 80 Gospels were considered for inclusion in the New Testament, but the church allowed only the Synoptic Gospels and the Gospel of John to go forward. And this choice was driven by the Emperor Constantine, who, in Brown's words, needed the strength of the new Christian tradition to shore up his claim to rule. And so he co-opted the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD to push through a vote on Jesus' divinity. And he, again a quote, commissioned and financed a new Bible which omitted those Gospels that spoke of Christ's human traits and embellished those Gospels that made him godlike, and the other Gospels were outlawed, gathered up, and burned. Now, if you've seen the film of the Da Vinci Code, you'll know that this conspiracy all gets played out in melodramatic fashion in the modern day, with albino monks commissioned by the Catholic Church to bump off anyone who gets too close to the truth of the matter. Which is all great fun, but of course it's absolute nonsense. Because the so-called secret books that Dan Brown talks about, which have allegedly been repressed by the church for centuries, are actually freely available for you to buy in Waterstones. And I'm happy to prove that by showing you a compendium of them tonight. And I'm yet to be targeted by albino monks, as far as I'm aware. So, what's the real story of how the New Testament came together? How did these 27 books come to be recognized as authentic and credible, while others were rejected? Who was it who made the choice, and how? Was it in fact the Emperor Constantine? And was there a moment in time when the church met together to approve the selection, after which the New Testament was set in stone? Well, the answer to these last two questions is no and no. Dan Brown makes great play of the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD as the moment, the point at which the church voted on what was in and what was out. But there is in fact no record of any such discussion or vote taking place. And whilst Constantine did commission and finance the production of sacred scriptures in 331 AD, there's absolutely no evidence that this was a new Bible. Because there's only one source for us and for Dan Brown around this, and that's the man who carried out the commission, Eusebius, who's the church historian who we discussed last week. And all Eusebius tells us is that Constantine ordered him to have copies made of existing books so that the growing number of churches in Constantinople could have access to the Word of God. And Eusebius makes no mention whatsoever of any attempt to control or censor the books that were copied. And in fact, he says nothing at all about what was copied, whether it was books of the Old Testament or the New Testament, or both. And those few historical facts should tell us that Dan Brown's thesis is nothing more than speculative fantasy. So what can we say for sure? Well, first of all, as we've just acknowledged, there were more than 27 books in circulation around the early church during the period leading up to the Council of Nicaea. We also know there was a debate within the church in its different locations as to which of these books were authoritative and authentic, and which should be rejected. And through this debate, a consensus gradually emerged, but not without differences of opinion. And it was actually sometime after the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD that this consensus began to solidify to the point where the books that we now recognise collectively as the New Testament were agreed through a process of reasoned discussion and analysis by a number of learned individuals. And it wasn't until the end of the 4th century, the late 300s, that any formal intent was made to agree and authorise the canon. So how did all that play out? Last time we mentioned that the first recorded use of the term New Testament probably comes in the writings of the Christian theologian, writer and apologist Tertullian, who lived in Carthage in North Africa between 155 and 220 AD. And in two of Tertullian's surviving works, he makes reference to there being two testaments, an old one and a new one. And the earliest of these works he wrote around 208 AD. And so we might easily conclude that this marks the point by which there was initial consensus around a collection of Christian writings which were recognised as of equal and parallel weight to the Hebrew Scriptures. But if we drew that conclusion, we'd be wrong. And we can say that because we've got an amount of direct evidence that the New Testament canon was still a subject for debate within the early church during and after this time. And this evidence is in the form of a number of different writings which offer lists of those books which should be considered authoritative and those that should be considered dubious or downright unacceptable. And we're going to look at 4 of those lists tonight as an illustration of this ongoing debate. And they're in chronological order. We'll start with something called the Muratorian fragment, which dates to the late 2nd century AD, around the time of Tertullian. But then we'll look at excerpts from the works of theologians Origen in the early mid-3rd century and our old friend Eusebius from the early 4th century. And then finally Athanasius, who was a bishop of Alexandria in Egypt, also in the 4th century. So let's take each one of these in turn, starting with the intriguingly named Muratorian fragment. It's actually a late Latin manuscript which dates to around the 8th century AD, and it gets its name from the scholar who discovered it in a monastery in northern Italy, who was called Father Ludovico Antonio Muratori in the 18th century. And it's commonly agreed to be a Latin translation of a Greek original. And the original is dated to the second half of the 2nd century AD, on the grounds that it says that the regime of Pius I, the 10th Bishop of Rome, is recent and in our time, in quotes. And we know that Pius was Bishop of Rome between 140 and 155 AD, and so the text of this fragment probably dates shortly after that, although there's no indication within it as to where it was first written or who produced it. And the manuscript is tatty and incomplete and written in fairly dodgy Latin. And it starts in mid-sentence and goes on to describe Christian writings that were clearly in circulation at the time and to talk about their authenticity. The first full sentence talks about the Gospel of Luke, whereafter the author then talks about the Gospel of John, the book of Acts, 13 of Paul's letters, 2 of John's letters, Jude, and the Apocalypse of John, which we more commonly call Revelation. And if we assume that Matthew and Mark's Gospels are mentioned at the start of the sentence with which the fragment begins, then there are 22 of the 27 New Testament books included within this list. Reflecting back on the debate that we mentioned last time when we talked about composition, the author clearly thinks that John's letters and the book of Revelation were written by the same person, because he or she says so in as many words. The fragment doesn't, however, mention the 3rd letter of John, or the letters of Peter and James, or the letter to the Hebrews. But it does comment on other works that must have been familiar to the church at the time. And these include 2 letters attributed to Paul and addressed to the churches in Laodicea and Alexandria, both of which are denounced as forgeries. There's also mention of 3 other books. First, the Book of Wisdom, which the author says was written by the friends of Solomon in his honour. Second, the Apocalypse or Revelation of Peter, which is paralleled with the Apocalypse of John, although the author says that some of us are not willing that it be read in church. And third, a book called The Shepherd of Hermas, of which the author says it ought indeed to be read, but it cannot be read publicly to the people in the church. And the reason given for this is that The Shepherd of Hermas was written after the time of the apostles and, by implication, did not therefore carry their seal of approval. And the fragment then finishes by giving a list of writers whose works cannot be accepted. Some of these we know to have been Gnostic theologians whose teaching was too far away from the core principles of Christianity. And others were followers of Marcion of Sinope, who was excommunicated by the church in Rome in 144 AD, but nonetheless set out to establish his own rival church with its own set of scriptures. Now, we could spend all night talking about this, because there's a lot of underlying detail, and we could easily allow ourselves to fall down any number of rabbit holes. And we'll come back and address some of the issues raised by the Muratorian fragment in a short while. But for the moment, let's continue with this task that we've set out for ourselves of looking at the evidence that we have of the emerging debate about what should and shouldn't be considered authoritative and authentic within the writings that were in circulation during this period. And our next list takes us into the 3rd century AD, and it comes from Origen, who was a theologian and scholar born in Alexandria in Egypt in 185 AD. And Origen spent the first half of his academic career in his home city before moving to Judea to create an institute of Christian learning in Caesarea Maritima. And that's the institute we mentioned last time, where Eusebius lived and worked as one of Origen's successors. And Origen studied and wrote prolifically and was considered one of the foremost experts on the Christian faith during his lifetime. And he died in the mid-250s AD as a victim of the persecution of Christians by the Roman Emperor Decius, who decided that a plague which swept the Roman Empire around this time was the result of Christians not recognizing him as divine. And it's a fascinating life. I mean, the writings and doctrines of Origen would be enough to fill a brick course all by themselves. But for our purposes tonight, we're just going to look at those bits of writings which are quoted by Eusebius in his History of the Early Church. And Eusebius brings together excerpts from a number of Origen's writings, which reflect on the authenticity of a number of New Testament books, including the Gospels, the letters of Paul, Peter and John, Hebrews, and the book of Revelation. There is, however, no surviving reflection from Origen on the remaining books that we'd recognize today as being canonical. Origen affirms that there are only 4 Gospels which are not disputed by the Church of God under heaven, which implies strongly that there were more Gospels which were disputed. And in discussing these 4, he emphasizes the traditions that Matthew was an apostle of Jesus, Mark was instructed by Peter, and Luke wrote for the particular benefit of Gentile Christians. He says little or nothing about John's Gospel, except that it came later than the other 3. But in a second excerpt, Origen is quoted as saying that the writer of the Gospel was the same man who wrote the Apocalypse, or Revelation, and also, in quotes, left behind an epistle of a very few lines, and possibly a second and third, for not everyone agrees that these are genuine, but taken together, both do not contain 100 lines, end quote. And with regard to Paul, Origen says that, again, quote, he did not write to all the churches he had taught, but to those he did write, he sent letters of just a few lines. Which seems like quite an odd thing to say when we look at much longer letters such as those to the Romans and Corinthians. And Origen then goes on to say that Peter left behind one letter that is acknowledged, and possibly a second, but it is disputed. Eusebius finishes his treatment of Origen's views with the letter to the Hebrews. And these views are principally concerned with trying to work out who wrote it. And rather amusingly, he says that the writing style of the epistle does not have the unskilled character of the apostle, by whom he means Paul, who admitted that he was an unskilled writer, at least with regard to style. The epistle is better Greek in its composition, but at the same time everyone will agree that the thoughts of the epistle are marvellous and in no way inferior to the accepted writings of the apostle, end quote. In other words, Origen doesn't think that Paul wrote the letter to the Hebrews, but that he then goes on to say, and again, quote, the thoughts appear to be those of the apostle, whereas the style and composition of the letter are those of someone who had his writings in mind. And Origen concludes that Hebrews should be considered acceptable teaching on this basis, before suggesting that it might have been the work of Luke acting on Paul's behalf, or it might have been our old friend Clement of Rome, who we met last time. But, and I quote, as to who wrote the epistle, God knows. It's a little disappointing not to have Origen's thoughts on rather more of the books that were in circulation during his lifetime. But there's ample compensation in the next list that we're going to look at which comes from the first quarter of the 4th century and belongs to Eusebius himself. Remember, by the time that Eusebius comes to write his history of the church, he's had the benefit of living and studying at the same centre of Christian learning as Origen. And he's been able to read and digest the thoughts of most, if not all, of the theologians and scholars who came before him, whose works were collected into the library where he worked at Caesarea Maritima. So when Eusebius gives time to listing and categorising the works that he has available to him, what he has to say is worth listening to. And not least because it demonstrates that around the time that Eusebius was writing, that is immediately prior to the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, there was still a very live debate around what was authoritative and authentic and what was less so. And if nothing else, that's a pretty solid contradiction of Dan Brown and all his conspiracy theories. Eusebius spends a whole chapter of his 3rd book looking at what he describes as New Testament writings. And that he's able to use that description in this way tells us that the term New Testament remained, even at this comparatively late stage, fairly elastic. It can't signify an agreed corpus of books because of what Eusebius himself goes on to say. And so we should probably interpret it as referring loosely to the body of Christian writing that developed in the years after Jesus' death and resurrection, but which was yet to be formalised. Eusebius divides these writings into 4 neat classes. First, he lists what he calls the accepted or recognised books, and these are the 4 Gospels, the Book of Acts, Paul's epistles, although he doesn't qualify this in the way that we saw in the Muratorian fragment, also 1 John and 1 Peter, and, quote, if it is thought proper, unquote, the book of Revelation. However, in including Revelation, Eusebius acknowledges that this is a contested position about which he intends to say more later in his history, and he does. And he then moves on to works that he describes as disputed yet familiar to most. And these are the epistles of James, Jude, and 2 Peter, as well as 2 and 3 John, which he says are, and again quote, the work either of the evangelist or of someone else with the same name. And you might remember us discussing this during the last session, Eusebius' equivocation as to whether there were in fact 2 Johns whose work appears in the New Testament. John the disciple whom Jesus loved and wrote the Gospel, and John who calls himself the elder in 2 of the 3 letters, and the doubt that we talked about over which work belonged to which John. The 3rd category that Eusebius talks about are described as spurious books, using a Greek adjective that can otherwise mean counterfeit or illegitimate. And these are mainly works which aren't included in our New Testament. Again, the Shepherd of Hermas and the Apocalypse of Peter, which both appeared in the Muratorian fragment, but also 3 other books, namely the Teachings of the Apostles, which we nowadays call the Didache, the Acts of Paul, and an Epistle of Barnabas. But there's also 2 more surprising entries into this category. First, the book of Revelation, about which Eusebius wonders whether this is the right place for it, on the grounds that, and I quote, some reject it and others include it among the recognised books. But also second, the letter to the Hebrews. Eusebius again notes that there are some who consider Hebrews to be spurious, although there are others who would say that it has, and I quote, a special appeal for those Hebrews who have accepted Christ. And before moving on to his 4th and final category, Eusebius draws a line between the books he's listed to date and those that he's about to list. His purpose is to make it clear that everything above the line is either true, genuine, and recognised according to the traditions of the church, or it is familiar to most churchgoers, but not canonical and disputed, all in quotes. And below the line are those he's yet to mention, works which are to be rejected on the grounds that they are absurd and godless. And Eusebius goes on to specify the works that he's rejecting. These, he says, are the writings of heretics who assume the names of the apostles, gospels in the names of Peter, Thomas, and Matthias, and books of Acts of Andrew and John, as well as more of these of both kinds. And Eusebius' rejection is on the grounds that none of these are referred to by any respectable theologian. And I quote, "Their literary character differs greatly from the style characteristically found in the apostolic writings, while the opinions that they express and their choice of material are so irreconcilable with true orthodoxy that they stand revealed as the forgeries of heretics." Now, our fourth and last list of books belongs to Athanasius, who was the Bishop of Alexandria in Egypt from 328 AD. And he was a highly influential theologian. He attended the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD as a young man and was part of the discussions which led to the formulation of the Nicene Creed that we still say in church today. As a bishop, he was a prolific letter writer, and he wrote every year to the churches under his jurisdiction to confirm the date of Easter celebrations and to hand out theological, pastoral, and practical advice. And the 39th of these letters was written in 367 AD. And in it, Athanasius chose to address the question of which books should comprise the authorized New Testament. And we should note the weight of this letter because it's different than that of the other three lists that we've considered so far this evening. Athanasius' list is prescriptive and it's instructive. He's a bishop with authority, telling churches what they should and shouldn't read, whereas Origen and Eusebius were historians and theologians, indulging in a largely academic argument, and nobody really knows what the Muratorian fragment represents. And the importance of Athanasius is that he's the first authority to prescribe the 27 books that we now recognize as the New Testament. And he does this because he recognizes that there's a number of other books in circulation which are apocryphal and heretical. And there's a risk that these will be confused with true scripture because of the similarity of the names by which they're described. And what he's therefore looking to do is to create clear blue water between what is traditional and correct teaching, divinely inspired, and what is false and will lead Christians astray. And his list is very businesslike and expressed in his own words without hesitation. The four Gospels and the book of Acts, what he describes as the 7 books by the apostles called the Catholic epistles, which are James, 2 letters of Peter, 3 letters of John and Jude, 14 letters of Paul, including the letter to the Hebrews, and the Apocalypse of John or Revelation. Now, around these, there's no real explanation or justification. The issues which were raised by our other list compilers about the letter to the Hebrews and the book of Revelation are simply ignored, as are the question marks which were placed next to the 2nd and 3rd letters of John, the 2nd letter of Peter, and the letters of James and Jude. And there's no formal indication of why Athanasius has chosen to press ahead with accepting these works, although we're able to speculate on that, as we will do in a moment. But first we should note that, as well as confirming these 27 books, Athanasius finds it necessary to comment on how other books should be treated within the churches that he oversees. And this he does in order to clarify the status of works which are, in his words, not included in the canon, but have nonetheless been designated by the fathers as books to be read to those who have recently come to faith and wish to be instructed in godliness, end quotes. And these are 2 books of wisdom of Solomon and Sirach, the books of Esther, Judith, and Tobit, which we would normally place in or around the Old Testament, the Shepherd of Hermas and the Didache, both of which we've seen Eusebius categorize as spurious books. And while Athanasius is happy for these to be read in church, he then expressly forbids that there should be any, and I quote, mention at all of apocryphal books created by heretics, who write them whenever they want, but try to bestow favour on them by assigning them dates, that by setting them forth as ancient, they can, on false grounds, be used to deceive the simple-minded. So, Athanasius' letter is clearly seeking to settle the issue of the New Testament canon within his diocese. But there's evidence that the discussion stayed alive for some time yet, even within his own church. For example, we find an Alexandrian scholar named Didymus the Blind, some 20 years later, disputing still the authority of 2 and 3 John, and declaring instead the validity of the Shepherd of Hermas, the Didache, and even the Epistle of Barnabas. And in fact, there's no evidence whatsoever of the books of the New Testament ever being ratified by a truly ecumenical council of the early church, i.e. one which gathered representatives from all the churches around the world. We know only of smaller and more localized synods that address the matter. One in Hippo in North Africa in 393 AD, for example, and another in the same region in Carthage in 397 AD. And both these synods conducted the same debate, and both concluded that Athanasius' canon should be recognised. But this came with a caveat. The record which survives of the synod in Carthage notes that its decision remains subject to consultation with what is referred to as the church across the sea, by which we understand the church in Rome. And there's a lot more that we could go on and say about the journey that Athanasius' canon followed in the subsequent years and the different twists and turns in the debate around which books were authoritative and which ones were, in Eusebius' terms, disputed, spurious, or rejected. But I want to spend the time that we've got left this evening going over some of the points that have been raised within the lists that we've been looking at, and especially the questions of why some books were considered authoritative, some were downgraded or rejected, and why it was important to do this at all. We'll start with the first question. Why were some books considered to be authoritative? And I think the answer to this lies in the subject matter that we covered in the first talk in this series. And there we emphasise the importance of authorship by people who either met and spoke with Jesus and accompanied him during his ministry, or by those who met and spoke with those people and could get from them a first-hand account of what happened both while Jesus was alive and after his death and resurrection. And the importance of this to the credibility and authority of the Gospels in particular is seminal to our idea of the Bible as a genuine and reliable historical document. And if we look at the debate which is ongoing in the works of Eusebius and others, we can see that a lot of it is concerned with authorship. Who wrote this book or this letter? Can we be sure that it was authored by the person whose name it carries? And again, we relayed some of this debate in the last talk. The traditions that Eusebius related about Matthew the tax collector, John Mark the follower and amanuensis of Peter, Luke the doctor who travelled with Paul and spent time interviewing those he knew to be eyewitnesses of Jesus' ministry. But there's also the care with which Eusebius picks his way through the thickets that surround the works that are commonly attributed to John. Which John? Was it the disciple who Jesus loved? Or was it someone else, maybe somebody who didn't meet Jesus? In which case, how can we trust what they write about him? And the various arguments that Eusebius in particular revisits twice and 3 times in his history show that these questions were taken very seriously within the early church in their quest to ensure that the scriptures that were read to and by their congregations delivered correct and authoritative teaching. And this is, I think, what lies behind the debates that we've looked at around the authenticity of the letters of Peter, John, James, and Jude. Because after all, if the names on the tins are accurate, then there's no real argument about whether to read these letters. Peter and John, Jesus' closest followers, two of the disciples who were chosen to accompany him up the mountain on which they witnessed the transfiguration, Jesus meeting and talking with Moses and Elijah. Peter, the man chosen by Jesus to lead his church. John, the disciple whom Jesus loved. And James and Jude, Jesus' own brothers, who were fully intimate with him by reason of the family bond. If it was truly they who wrote these letters, then how could they not be authoritative? And this, I think, is the point that Athanasius had probably reached when he published his definitive list of 27 books. And that there's no recorded debate in his letter probably indicates that he'd asked himself and others whether Hebrews really was written by Paul or Luke, whether Revelation really was written by John the disciple, and whether the letters of Peter, James, John, and Jude could really be attributed to Jesus' disciples and brothers. And the answer he obviously came up with was yes. And why these books might not be authentic is revealed in the manner of the discussions in and around the lists that we've examined. Both Eusebius and Athanasius identify that there were a number of fraudulent documents in existence, writings which claimed to be authored by Jesus' disciples or the apostles of the early church, but were in fact not so. And both of their accounts urge caution when it comes to attributing works to particular individuals, because their experience was that there were a number of wolves out there who were dressed in sheep's clothing. And so we see Origen and Eusebius and Athanasius all trying to get under the bonnet of these writings to examine how trustworthy they are, to see what evidence they can find to confirm their authorship. And we've heard all three of these theologians talk about language and style, about composition and subject matter, comparing what they read in these dubious works with what they read elsewhere in works that they know to be genuine, and using this as a test to see if they can identify consistency between the books, and not being afraid to express doubt if they can't see it. Because after all, it will have required some courage on the part of Origen and Eusebius in particular to take books that some people thought were written by disciples and to question whether that was really the case. Because authorship clearly mattered. If it wasn't by a disciple or an apostle, then it wasn't authoritative. And we can see this in the attitude towards some of the fringe works that are considered and commented on by our list makers. For example, the Shepherd of Hermas, the Didache, and the Epistle of Barnabas. All of these were cleared for reading to and by the church congregations, but all fell short of the standard required to recognise them as canonical. And the implication is that their contents are orthodox and helpful for Christians to read as they develop their faith, but they're not written by people who were close to Jesus, and so they can only ever be second-rate works. Incidentally, all three of those books are freely available for us to read today. And the Harrogate School of Theology and Mission did a special on the Didache in November 2024, if you're interested. And the recording of that's still available on the HSTM website, if you'd like to follow that up. And as for the rejected books, the Muratorian fragment, Eusebius and Athanasius all give us clues as to why it was important to call these out. The Muratorian fragment mentions specifically writings which were associated with Marcion of Sinope. And Marcion was considered to be a heretic who taught that Jesus was distinct from the God of the Israelites and actually represented a different God altogether, and that Jesus himself was never fully human, but only a representation of a man. And we can see from that the need to ensure that writings which propagated these kinds of ideas were kept at arm's length and beyond, and never allowed to pollute the teachings of the church. And this wasn't the only heresy that arose during the first 300 or 400 years of church history. And we know that others, including and especially Gnosticism, were quite prolific in the writings that they produced. And there were several books and letters in circulation around that time which sought to get around these safeguards and gained credibility and traction by pretending that they were written by disciples or apostles. The Muratorian fragment deals with bogus letters of Paul to the churches in Laodicea and Alexandria, while Eusebius mentions Gospels of Peter, Thomas and Matthias, and books of Acts of Andrew and John. And this book I waved at you earlier has other works that are attributed to the likes of Mark, Mary, James and Philip. And as to why these forgeries were produced, there's probably several reasons. One is that the promoters of these heresies sought to send their ideas into the mainstream by fooling people that they actually emanated from Jesus and his immediate family and associates. Having a disciple or an apostle's name on the jacket would at least get their book through the door, after which who knows how many people might be converted to their way of thinking. And another potential reason is that this was a good way to undermine the burgeoning Christian faith. We know that Christianity faced plenty of opposition as it spread across the Mediterranean during this time period, both from Jews and from those Roman citizens who practiced emperor worship and polytheism, and also from other faiths whose temples and rituals made lots of money from their devotees. And publishing bogus scripture would have been a great way to corrupt Christianity and slow its advance by introducing contradictory ideas and ethics into the different churches' teaching. And a third potential reason is money. There were a number of prestigious libraries across the ancient world who were enthusiastic collectors of books from all cultures and traditions. And we've mentioned last time and this time the Christian Centre of Learning at Caesarea Maritima. There was also a library at Rome, where Bishop Clement is likely to have accessed the collection of Paul's letters that we discussed last time. And there were other celebrated libraries in places like Alexandria, Antioch, Ephesus, and Pergamum, which were all vying with each other to have the biggest collections and to attract the most prestigious academics and intellectuals to study there. And these libraries were prepared to pay significant sums of money to purchase the works that they needed to fulfill their aspirations. And so, simply put, there was a lucrative market at the time for books that claimed to be authentic. And as we pull this together, I don't know about you, but I'm again reassured, as I was the last time we spoke, by the fact that in the face of all of this, there were learned and faithful individuals like Origen and Eusebius and Athanasius who were prepared to do the spade work to authenticate the books that they were reading, and that they had clear criteria by which to judge these books. Did they include first-hand evidence? Were they written by, or did they draw on people who were there? Do we see Jesus in the same way across all of them? Are they internally consistent? Is there a continuity of theology, of orthodoxy, of teaching and ethics? Is there stylistic consistency between the different works of a single writer? And if the answer to these questions is yes, then they are reliable and authoritative, and we should take them to our heart. And if not, then we should label them as disputed or spurious, put them at arm's length, or reject them altogether. And I hope that that's reassuring for you too. We could go on down these roads, but I think just looking at time, we'll call a halt there, and I will try to answer any questions that you may have arising from what we've talked about this evening. And my beautiful assistant will gallop around the room with a microphone to field any questions. Thank you.